Hello, this is the RPG Crawler, and welcome to another Shelf of Many Things, where I take a look at independent and small press tabletop role-playing games and RPG accessories. This time I'm looking at yet another OSR offering. This one is not strictly a retro clone, but rather a retro-compatible system designed to feature a more historically medieval feel, which is a somewhat different prospect from your standard fantasy fare. It still retains that general familiarity to veterans of the OSR, but it offers something different. Written by RPG Pundit, Lion and Dragon was published by Dice of Might Publishing and was released a few years ago in the 2016 to 2017 era. And I already know that some people are probably going to go off about the author in the comments, and I just want to let you know, I don't care. So let's on and look at the actual product. Lion and Dragon is available as both a PDF and a print product. I will be covering the version available on Amazon as far as actual print quality and build goes, but only in brief since, as you can tell, it pretty much is a typical print-on-demand style offering from that particular outlet. It is available as a hardcover from Lulu.com, however, if you prefer that form factor, and I can't really go into the quality there because I haven't tried it out yet, but in my experience, Lulu has a little bit better quality in terms of their print a lot of times. As always, I'll go over the physical form factor and interior layout in brief, give a summary of the contents section by section, and then present my thoughts on the system as a whole at the end. The version available on Amazon is a pretty typical softcover with a full color cover done by Dominique Cruzet and a black and white interior, clocking in at about 130 pages. The interior is mostly two-column black and white with inline black and white illustrations, the occasional full-page illustration, illustrated subsection headings, and inline tables where appropriate. Pretty typical for RPG fare, I know, except the presentation of the text follows a more plain and old-school flow in terms of its layout, and many of the interior illustrations and embellishments are either taken from medieval to Renaissance era art and woodcuts or inspired by them. And what modern art is there generally focuses on a more authentic looking character and scene layout rather than the high fantasy that one might expect of a more generic OSR system. Think more along the lines of knights in armor in a field rather than elves and dwarves in subterranean halls. This, along with the illustrated subsection headings, drop cap section titles, and other minor embellishments, evokes the feel of a medieval-era text, or at least a modern echo thereof, just enough to help build the overall feel. As far as the actual contents go, there is an introduction, 10 chapters, an appendix, and end materials. After the introduction, there is a chapter on creating a character, one on skill checks, a chapter on classes, the magic system in Lion and Dragon, currency and equipment, procedures for the game master, the combat system, general non-combat health and hazard topics, the experience system, and finally a chapter on treasure. The appendix is dominated by a brief bestiary, but also covers medieval-styled trials and wilderness adventuring. In depth, we'll start with the introduction. Lion and Dragon aims to reinforce the feel of an authentic medieval world while using familiar systems. And to that end, the introduction goes into some of the main differences you can keep in mind while running the system as such. After a general introduction to the system itself and mentions of the Dark Albion setting, the basic assumptions of any setting played with the system are then covered in turn. Social status and its prime importance in medieval society is covered in depth, followed by the focus on monotheism's prevalence in the historical era modeled. The last three ideas that really anchor the setting in terms of its feel are kind of connected to one another. There's the cheapness of life, the rarity of magic, and the fact that civilization is critical to survival in a hostile world, and they all lend a sort of gravity to the feel of the system, or at least to the worlds that you use with it. The chapter on creating a character will be somewhat familiar to OSR veterans, although there are a few critical changes. Lion and Dragon uses the classic 6 stats, the stats of strength, dexterity, constitution, intelligence, wisdom, and charisma, with the classic bell curve of -3 to +3 kind of distributed out rather than in a more linear bonus that you'd expect of more modern systems. Since the system puts an emphasis on authentic medievalism, you select from ethnicities rather than fantasy races. And this is one system where I won't nitpick the use of ethnicity or heritage to refer to a character's background, simply because it's actually the proper use of the term this time. Although amusingly enough, Lion and Dragon does follow a more BX and prior era system of allocating the classic classes to the standard English human character, but then treating things like Scotsman and Cymry as their own classes, rather than like just races upon which you then tag classes. In addition to ability scores, however, English characters do have to roll a social class, which will give them a place all the way from serfdom to potentially a member of the aristocracy. This can seriously impact the way that the world treats them. They also gain a background skill based on their social status and may roll to find out about their prior history, which can give additional resources, skills, and other benefits, in addition to interesting tales to start the game. The chapter continues with a list of appropriate names, as well as guidance on authentically medieval-sounding names for various social classes and ethnicities. Character creation then continues with character class selection, as well as what you need to create a character at 0th level, which is where play begins in Lion and Dragon. Other details follow, including alignment. Lion and Dragon does use alignment, and good on that. It follows a single-axis law-chaos style of a classic OSR-style system. The book goes on to give guidelines on age and appearance, as well as the sex of a particular character, but also gives a basic system to determine a character's surviving family, which, is important because family plays such a critical role in medieval society. A character's wealth and equipment is mostly determined by the character's social class rather than character class, except, of course, for clerics, Scotsmen, or Cymry, which are set in a particular social class in terms of starting gear, just straight up. The skill checks chapter isn't really a chapter so much as a couple paragraphs. Lion and Dragon uses the D20 style of D20 plus ability mod plus skill bonus versus difficulty number that you're probably familiar with if you've played a D20 system. But rather than a bunch of different static skill ranks, you really only need to worry about those particular few skills that your character actually knows. There are a few details regarding taking 10 and assisting with skills here as well. The character classes are then covered. Characters start at 0th level, but each class determines what the character gains as they level up. There are 6 classes in all. The classic 4, there's clerics, fighters, magisters, and thieves, and then the Cymry, which are the Welsh, and the Scotsmen. This is basically kind of your basic setup that you would expect from BX, but as opposed to those more classic BX systems, each of these 6 classes actually has a different statistic as its requirement all the way across the standard 6 rather than just focusing on the 4 plus Constitution and Charisma. So it actually brings a nice balance in that regard that's missing from a lot of OSR systems. As presented in the character class section, each character class has a name, an intro paragraph, a minimum ability score that you can figure out in requiring, how many hit points they receive, what combat bonus they get, their saving throw number, because you only get 1 in this particular game, then any special abilities that they have. This is where some of the more stark differences come into play, though. Lion and Dragon is a little lower powered than even most BX-based systems. Hit points accrue far more slowly, and combat bonuses are generally flat across the board. Rather than bonuses across the board every single level, each level instead gives you a random selection among the bonuses that you can acquire at each level. Classes don't necessarily have their own unique experience table because they use a sort of unified experience system that's explained at the end. Character classes are a little bit more varied than their typical old-school counterparts as well. Clerics get a selection of miraculous powers rather than spells, and magisters get a bit of various lore from various, types of sciences, above and beyond simply, the spell casting involved in the new magic/occult system. Fighters are much the same as they've always been, but thieves are a little bit more simplified. Cymry occupy a sort of jack-of-all trades position similar to OSR elves, while Scotsmen are more like the old-school berserkers. The Miracles and Magic system goes into more details on the new magic areas. Rather than simple spells in the old Vancian system, spellcasters must make a difficulty check to evoke their special abilities, with the risk of failure possibly resulting in serious consequences. Clerics get a selection of 8 miracles, which range from classic things such as turn undead to spell-like effects that are more paladin-esque in their blessings. This keeps them from being carbon copy mobile aid stations, and clerics can also have to consider how they're going to actually serve their faith, rather than being a sort of fire and forget style priest that is common in most other modern systems. Magisters get something other than spells. Rather than Vancian style spell effects, they get a number of magical techniques. These are detailed each in their own system. There's summoning, which allows the Magister to, with a lot of effort, call upon the forces of demons and direct them into service to accomplish supernatural tasks or gain knowledge. It's something more akin to goetic invocations. The summoning system itself is several pages long and is the most obviously supernatural of all the magical techniques. The others are all grouped under the magical skills. There's astrology that allows for a bit of divination. There's cures, which can produce various medicines. Banishing allows the Magister to banish spirits and evil influences. Battle magic is more what you'd expect from classic spellcasting, but it's more limited, mostly involving explosives and the like. Astrological talismans give various bonuses to certain things, but require a bit of preparation to cost and actually use. And there's finally true alchemy, which can produce concoctions with a variety of both mundane and supernatural effects to them, even up to creating golems and homunculi, or even the elixir of life or the philosopher's stone. Each of these magical skills is detailed with up to several pages of guidelines and rules behind each of them. Now, after you've gone through all of that, there is the currency and equipment system. The currency equipment system goes into coinage, somewhat at least, although there is the caveat that most trade and economic exchanges actually take place on a non-monetary basis in the medieval period. There's lists of various weapons and armor, as well as other gear, and their associated cost ranges in pounds and shillings. Actual specifics are left until later. Due to the fact that the equipment is of a more medieval flavor than your standard OSR system, the actual names and qualities do vary from what you might be used to, in some instances rather radically from your typical OSR stuff. Weapons also go so far as primitive firearms, with a fairly decent amount of time spent on real estate, taxation, and other expenses, such as basic wages for hirelings, cost of living, that sort of thing. The encumbrance system is sort of abstracted, being listed in a number of items that the character can carry rather than actual weight, which is similar in some ways to some other abstracted OSR encumbrance systems that I've seen, and I find that they work pretty well. The weapon and armor mechanics section follow, and it's very similar to what you've seen in other OSR systems, and get used to me saying that because, after all, this is a BX at its core. Lion and Dragon uses an ascending AC system for armor, so you do need to keep that in mind. Fighters and clerics, however, get more benefit from armor than other classes, which kind of balances out the relatively mundanity of the fighter class. Weapon damage is based on weapon size rather than a particular weapon type, and both weapons and armor may have other adjustments to skills or initiative based on their size and their type. Some consideration is given to early firearm mechanics, and there is a mechanic for named weapons, so characters can actually receive minor bonuses for adopting a particular signature weapon and naming it. There's also some surprisingly detailed rules on poison use, herbal medicines, and non-alchemical or non-magical alchemical substances, with specific historical examples on each, including, the DC that you need to use them, the cost, that sort of thing. These come, complete with difficulty to find / handle, as I mentioned, cost, but also the effects on each. The chapter on Game Master procedures is sort of a miscellaneous wrap-up of important rules that the players don't need to know about, but are important for the DM to know. There's rules for NPC reaction rules, rules for morale, and then guidelines for travel times and survival, important elements in a world where the space between civilization is incredibly dangerous. More applicable to both players and GMs is the combat system. This is largely similar to other OSR systems. I've said that about a zillion times so far. Get used to it, as I said. Though I will note that hit point ranges tend to be somewhat lower comparatively to even other OSR systems. Lion and Dragon uses the 6-second round scaling type, and there's rules for encounter distance and surprise attacks, although surprise attacks are a little bit more detailed than they are in other OSR systems. Initiative is similar, using a d6 modified by dex, and then actions are actually more defined than in any other OSR system that I've taken a look at so far. They're a little bit less formal than other modern systems, but it's nice to have that sort of clarity. Each potential action category a character can take in a round is described, and although this takes up more space, as I said, it clears up some ambiguities that are present in some other OSR systems. Attacks are handled as you'd expect with a d20 test versus the AC, although there is a crit table, and that kind of makes combat even more brutal than the limited hit points may, kind of suggest. I will say that there are, rules for things like parrying, firing in a melee, mounted combat, and such, and you're probably going to want to use them if you really get into the system. Likewise, there are some other things that are expanded on in more detail. There are grappling rules, which is simplified, which is simplified, but just as effective as it would be in a more modern system. And again, this is more important in a proper medieval kind of way, because you aren't going to want to kill everybody you come across in an actual medieval world. You're going to want to disable them. You're going to want to try and disarm them. If they're a heavily armored knight and you're having trouble hitting their AC, then dropping them with grappling may be an option. Anyway, there is a chapter on health and hazards, as you've probably noticed by now, and that covers injury, what goes into what happens after a character drops to 0 hit points or less. It's a touch more complex of a system than most OSR systems, and it actually sits somewhere between the 0 hit points and you're dead kind of school of thought and systems that give you a little bit of a range of survival under 0 hit points. In Lion and Dragon, you do have that buffer under 0, but it's not a very big buffer, so you're going to want to avoid it. It also got seriously consequences for if you actually fall into that area. Saving throws in Lion and Dragon are handled with a single number based on the individual character, although this single number may be modified based on the type of attack that you're facing in your particular class and the scores. There are healing rules given, which are typical slow for OSR systems, but actually augmentable via herbs and such due to a lack of magic, which can kind of mitigate that overall. You still take time to rest and recover, but not nearly so much as you'd probably expect. There are aging and illness rules, that sort of thing. A few real-world examples of diseases are given, or at least the most common that a character is probably going to encounter. There are falling and fire damage rules that kind of round out the chapter. They are handled similarly to other OSR systems, and I actually appreciate the fact that fire damage gets its own specific mention and rule set covered at the same time as falling damage, because the implication of that is that characters are far more likely to get set on fire and burn than in other similar systems. But you know what? Whether they are or not in your game, that's irrelevant, because in my game, now that you've got such clear and evident catch on fire rules, yeah, character's going to spend a little while on fire. Yeah, sorry, but you're going to burn. The final 2 chapters of the book are experience and then treasure/valuables. Now, experience in Lion and Dragon is unified. All characters have the same experience table, which technically expands to 12th, but there are rules for 13 plus. Rather than getting experience for creatures and treasure, as in so many OSR systems, experience is awarded based on sessions participated in, major quest completion, and then there's some optional rules for additional experience based on player interaction. And, I'll get into the effects that has on the game in a little bit. Treasure and valuables have charts for various treasure items with the appropriate treasure kind of value range, but treasure types are given as proper categories, like creature/foe/cache categories, like criminal or religious. So a treasure cache in a church or on a group of pilgrims is going to be a little bit different than a treasure in a bandit lair. There's no mounds and mounds of coins in any of these treasure tables, although there may be a handful of them. Rather than that, most of the treasure is just, items of value, things of worth. That's more appropriate for the setting. Now, there are technically magical items in the game, despite its focus on authentic medievalism. They're mostly minor, or they are based on legend and myth. Now, you're not going to find any Vorpal swords, crystal balls, or flying carpets or such, but you'll find things like the Agincourt bows, King Owain's ring, or Robin's arrows, things you might expect from like Robin Hood tales or Arthurian legend, that sort of thing. Finally, there is the Appendix, way after this. The Appendix starts with a bestiary. There's mostly common creatures, animals, and so forth. There are a few supernatural creatures of myth within. So each of them has a name, a stat blocks, initiative, AC, save, morale, hit dice, movement, alignment, and then a list of attacks and damage, with any special qualities they have listed underneath. And almost every creature, even the mundane ones, has some sort of special quality. Like even down here, even like boars and bears have like some sort of special quality or attack to them. And that does help mix them up. And it's just nice to have it laid out like that. You'll note that experience is removed from the actual combat section here, of course, because it is treated differently in this system. After the bestiary, there is an entire system on handling criminal trials, and that can be pretty important just because it takes into account the various elements of medieval justice, which are very different than a modern person might think of when they think of going to trial. And that's just something that a lot of games gloss over, but it's important for a medieval period game. Finally, the Appendix finishes up with rules for wilderness exploration and randomization of things in the wilderness, and then closes with, your usual character sheet and material, that sort of thing. So, excuse the poor quality of my print on demand offering here. This has definitely seen better days, and that's after only a thumb through for this review and a couple of uses. So it may give you an indication of what type you may want to actually purchase. What do I think about the system of Lion and Dragon? Well, in terms of presentation, I will say the art is well selected. There is a difference between the classical, medieval, and Renaissance art and the modern illustrations in it, but they still come together into a sort of cohesive whole rather well. The minor embellishments, as I mentioned before, do give it a sort of a medieval reference feel without actually having it be as cumbersome and overwrought as an actual illuminated medieval text, and trust me on this, that's a good thing. It is well written and much more clearly organized than a number of OSR systems that I've actually taken a look at, without falling prey to the more modern systemic feel that some other systems have taken. It walks this line on the one hand by including abstracted rules where they are useful, such as encumbrance and experience systems, as well as thoroughly explaining and clarifying ambiguities in the rules that are common to OSR games. On the other hand, it maintains that loose feel of the rules and the rules applications so that the GM can adapt them to particular circumstances. It weaves real-world examples and historicity into the rules where it is necessary, and it includes a heavy dose of lore regarding the Dark Albion setting without making it explicitly intrinsic to the rules like, say, the Auran Empire is into the Autarch offerings. Lion and Dragon manages to be clear and unambiguous in its presentation of many of the rules without talking down to you or overly holding your hand. Now, this differs from my kind of idea of things, although in this case I have to say it works. It assumes that you are an experienced role player and not an idiot, and yet it is clear enough that in many cases you can probably play it even if you are new, and possibly even if you are an idiot. I find the approach of the standard elements of the rules pretty straightforward, and the new additions range from interesting to unintentionally hilarious. Things like the importance of social status, the crit system, and the means of equipping your character lend a lot of authenticity to the game, while the idea that you can play a normal human or, a Welshman or Scotsman is moderately amusing. The minor adjustments to class progression, lower hit point accumulation, randomization and limitation on what specific special abilities you get at each level, the lack of hard fantasy magic, and the existence of crit hits with lasting consequences, disease, and more, all combine with the decoupling of experience from defeating monsters to make combat a more cautiously approached affair. Violence becomes at once both much more effective, but also much more risky. So while a party of particularly bloodthirsty knights pillaging the countryside is entirely possible, more reasoned approaches to problems are actually encouraged by the system itself. Finally, the magic system, that is, the skills, summoning, alchemy, and so forth, is a grand departure from the typical Vancian spellcasting. I could say that they are well researched, mostly drawn from historical record and hermetic traditions, or in the case of the miracles, from common myth and tradition. The way that these systems make magical undertakings complex, time-consuming, resource-consuming, and possibly risky makes them something that you really want to only take magical opportunity when it's needed or when the potential gain makes it worthwhile. I also can't help but think that the miracle system, or just the system in general, could probably benefit from some sort of virtue system like what you see in the Pendragon game for religious knights or romantic knights. I am aware that there are other products available in the Dark Albion line that accompanies this system, so I don't know, maybe there's something like that in one of those books. I'm not sure. I'll have to take a look at them. Regardless, how magic is handled in Lion and Dragon is a wonderful departure from the same old of other Vancian systems, and even a departure from the kind of risky magic that you see in games like DCC RPG. And it is amusing, mostly because it is literally the same old based on actual medieval tradition. All in all, Lion and Dragon is a niche system, don't get me wrong. It's designed for one particular type of game, a game based on medieval authenticity or historical veracity using OSR rules. What it does, I think it does extremely well. If you're looking to run a game in that particular niche, I can't think of a better system off the top of my head, and in that case, I will highly recommend it if you're looking to play that kind of game. If you want historical authenticity but are willing to go with a non-OSR style system, it does have a precious few competitors in terms of quality and ease of use, I will admit that, so there is something to consider there. If you want more typical OSR fantasy, however, you're probably better served with another system. Although it is associated with the Dark Albion setting, none of the rules are married to that setting, so you can reasonably use it with anything that presents that sort of mythical version of medieval Europe, and with some minor adjustments, if you wanted to set it on the continent, you could do that instead. And I'm already thinking of a few fantasy historical settings that have recently put out for the OSR that it could be used with. And I think, that about sums up Lion and Dragon. With that said, I'm going to wrap this review up here. This has been the RPG Crawler with my review of Lion and Dragon. As always, I'll throw out some links to where you can pick it up below. If you like what you've seen, remember to leave a like, comment if you got any feedback, and subscribe for more RPG content, both tabletop and computer. Mostly computer, but occasionally tabletop. Until next time, take care and goodbye.